Coming home to Dehra. The faint queasiness I always feel towards the end of a journey probably has its origin in that first homecoming after my father's death. It was the winter of '44. Yes, a long time ago. And the train was running through the thick sal forest near Dehra, bringing me at every click of the rails nearer to the mother I hadn't seen for 4 years and the stepfather I had seen just once or twice before my parents were divorced. I was 11, and I was coming home to Dehra. 3 years earlier, after the separation, I had gone to live with my father. We were very happy together. He was serving in the RAF at New Delhi, and we lived in a large tent somewhere near Humayun's tomb. The area is now a very busy part of urban Delhi, but in those days it was a wilderness of scrub jungle where black buck and nilgai roamed freely. We took long walks together, exploring the ruins of old tombs and forts, went to the pictures. George Formby comedies were special favorites of mine. Collected stamps, brought books my father had taught me to read and write before I started going to school, and made plans for going to England when the war was over. 6 months of bliss, even though it was summer and there weren't any fans, only a thick coos reed, which had to be splashed with water every hour by the Bitsy, water carrier, who did the rounds of similar tents with his goatskin water bag. I remember the tender, refreshing fragrance of the coos, and also the smell of damp earth outside where the water had spilt. A happy time, but it had to end. My father's periodic bouts of malarial fever resulted in his having to enter hospital for a week. The Bitsy's small son came to stay with me at night, and during the day I took my meals with an Anglo-Indian family across the road. I would have been quite happy to continue with this arrangement whenever my father was absent, but someone at Air Headquarters must have advised him to put me in a boarding school. Reluctantly, he came to the decision that this would be the best thing until the war is over, and in the June of '43, he took me to Shimla, where I was incarcerated in a preparatory school for boys. This is not the story of my life at boarding school. It might easily have been a public school in England. It did, in fact, pride itself on being the Eton of the East. The traditions, such as ragging and flogging, compulsory games and chapel attendance, prefects larger than life, and honor boards for everything from school captaincy to choir membership, had all apparently been borrowed from Tom Brown's school days. My father wrote to me regularly, and his letters were things I looked forward to more than anything else. I went to him for winter holidays, and the following summer he came to Shimla during my midterm break and took me out for the duration of the holidays. We stayed in a hotel called Craig Dhu on a spur north of Jacko Hill. It was an idyllic week. Long walks, story about phantom rickshaws, ice creams in the sun, browsings in bookshops, more plans. We will go to England next year. School seemed stupid and heartless place after my father had gone away. He had been transferred to Calcutta, and he wasn't keeping well there. Malaria again, and then jaundice. But his last letter sounded quite cheerful. He'd been selling part of his valuable stamp collection so as to have enough money for the fares to England. One day, my class teacher sent for me. "I want to talk to you, Bond," he said. "Let's go for a walk." I knew immediately that something was wrong. We took the path that went through the Deodar forest, past Council Rock where scout meetings were held. As soon as my unfortunate teacher, no doubt cursing the headmaster for having given him this unpleasant task, started on the theme of God wanting your father in a higher and better place, as though there could be any place better than Jacko Hill in midsummer, I knew my father was dead, and burst into tears. They let me stay in the school hospital for a few days until I felt better. The headmaster visited me there and took away the pile of my father's letters I'd kept beside me. "Your father's letters. You might lose them. Why not leave them with me? Then at the end of the year before you go home, you can come and collect them." Unwillingly, I gave him the letters. He told me he'd heard from my mother that I would be going home to her at the end of the year. He seemed surprised that I evinced no interest in this prospect. At the end of the year, the day before school closed, I went to the headmaster's office and asked for my letters. "What letters?" he said. The desk was piled with papers and correspondence, and he was irritated by my interruption. "My father's letters," I explained. "I gave them to you to keep for me, sir, when he died." "Letters? Are you sure you gave them to me?" He grew more irritated. "You must be mistaken, Bond. Why should I want to keep your father's letters?" I don't know, sir. You said I could collect them before going home. Look, I don't remember any letters, and I'm very busy just now, so run along. I'm sure you're mistaken, but if I find your letters, I'll send them to you. I don't suppose he meant to be unkind, but he was the first man who aroused feelings of hate in me. As the train drew into Dehra, I looked out the window to see if there was anyone on the platform waiting to receive me. The station was crowded enough, as most railway stations are in India, with overloaded travelers, shouting coolies, stray dogs, stray station masters. Pandemonium broke loose as the train came to a halt and people debouched from the carriages. I was thrust on the platform with my tin trunk and small attaché case. I sat on the trunk and waited for someone to find me. Slowly the crowd melted away. I was left with one elderly coolie who was too feeble to carry heavy luggage and had decided that my trunk was just the right size and weight for his head and shoulders. I waited another 10 minutes, but no representative of my mother or stepfather appeared. I permitted the coolie to lead me out of the station to the Tonga stand. Those were the days when everyone, including high-ranking officials, went about in Tongas. Dehra had just one taxi. I was quite happy sitting beside the rather smelly, pond-spitting Tonga driver, while his weary, underfed pony clip-clopped along the quiet, tree-lined roads. Dehra was always a good place for trees. The valley soil is fertile, the rainfall fairly heavy. Almost anything grows there, if given the chance. The roads were lined with neem and mango trees, eucalyptus, Persian lilac, jacaranda, amaltas, laburnum, and others. In the gardens of the bungalows were mangoes, lychees, and guavas, sometimes jackfruits and papaya. I did not notice all these trees at once. I came to know them as time passed. The Tonga first took me to my grandmother's house. I was under the impression that my mother still lived there. A lovely, comfortable bungalow that spread itself about the grounds in an easy-going, old-fashioned way. There was even smoke coming from the chimneys, reminding me of the smoke from my grandfather's pipe. When I was 8, I had spent several months there with my grandparents. In retrospect, it had been an idyllic interlude, but grandfather was dead. Grandmother lived alone. White-haired, but still broad in the face and even broader behind, she was astonished to see me getting down from the Tonga. "Didn't anyone meet you at the station?" she asked. I shook my head. Grandmother said, "Your mother doesn't live here anymore. You can come in and wait, but she may be worried about you, so I'd better take you to her place. Come on, help me get into the Tonga." I might have known it would be a white horse. It always makes me nervous sitting in a Tonga behind a white horse. "Why, Granny?" "I don't know. I suppose white horses are nervous too. Anyway, they're always trying to topple me out. Not so fast, driver," she called out, as the Tonga man cracked his whip and the pony changed from a slow shuffle to a brisk trot. It took us about 25 minutes to reach my stepfather's house, which was in the Dalanwala area, not far from the dry bed of the seasonal Rispana River. My grandmother, seeing that I was in need of moral support, got down with me, while the Tonga driver carried my bedding roll and tin trunk out onto the veranda. The front door was bolted from inside. We had to knock on it repeatedly and call out before it was opened by a servant who did not look pleased at being disturbed. When he saw my grandmother, he gave her a deferential salaam, and then gazed at me with open curiosity. "Where's the Memsahib?" asked grandmother. "Out," said the servant. "I can see that, but where have they gone?" "They went yesterday to Matachur for shikar. They'll be back this evening." Grandmother looked upset, but motioned to the servant to bring in my things. "Weren't they expecting the boy?" she asked. "Yes," he said, looking at me again, "but they said he would be arriving tomorrow." "They'd forgotten the date," said grandmother in a huff. "Anyway, you can unpack and have a wash and change your clothes." Turning to the servant, she asked, "Is there any lunch?" "I will make lunch," he said. He was staring at me again, and I felt uneasy with his eyes on me. He was tall and swarthy, with oily, jet-black hair and a thick mustache. A heavy scar ran down his left cheek, giving him a rather sinister appearance. He wore a torn shirt and dirty pajamas. His broad, heavy feet were wet. They left marks on the uncarpeted floor. A baby was crying in the next room, and presently a woman, who turned out to be the cook's wife, appeared in the doorway, jogging the child in her arms. "They've left the baby behind too," said grandmother, becoming more and more irate. "He is your younger brother, only 6 months old." I hadn't been told anything about a younger brother. The discovery that I had one came something as a shock. I wasn't prepared for a baby brother, least of all a baby half-brother. I examined the child without much enthusiasm. He looked healthy enough, and he cried with gusto. "He's a beautiful baby," said grandmother. "Well, I've got work to do. The servants will look after you. You can come and see me in a day or two. You've grown since I last saw you, and you're getting pimples." This reference to my appearance did not displease me, as my grandmother never indulged in praise. For her to have observed my pimples indicated that she was fond of me. The tonga driver was waiting for her. "I suppose I'll have to use the same tonga," she said. "Whenever I need a tonga they disappear, except for the ones with white ponies. When your mother gets back, tell her I want to see her. Shikar indeed. An infant to look after, and they've gone shooting." Grandmother settled herself into the tonga, nodded in response to the cook's salaam, and took a tight grip of the armrest of her seat. The driver flourished his whip, and the pony set off at the same listless, unhurried trot, while my grandmother, feeling quite certain that she was going to be hurtled from her doom to her doom by a wild white pony, set her teeth and clung tenaciously to the tonga seat. I was sorry to see her go. My mother and stepfather returned in the evening from their hunting trip with a pheasant, which was duly handed over to the cook, whose name was Mangal Singh. My mother gave me a perfunctory kiss. I think she was pleased to see me, but I was accustomed to a more intimate caress from my father, and the strange reception I had received made me realize the extent of my loss. Boarding school life had been routine. Going home was something that I had always looked forward to. But going home had meant my father, and now he had vanished, and I was left quite desolate. I suppose if one is present when a loved one dies, or sees him dead and laid out and later buried, one is convinced of the finality of the thing and finds it easier to adapt to the changed circumstances. But when you hear of a death, a father's death, and have only the faintest idea of the manner of his dying, it's rather a lot for the imagination to cope with, especially when the imagination is a small boy's. There being no tangible evidence of my father's death, it was for me not a death but a vanishing. And although this enabled me to remember him as a living, smiling, breathing person, it meant that I was not wholly reconciled to his death, and subconsciously expected him to turn up, as he often did, when I needed him most, and deliver me from an unpleasant situation. My stepfather barely noticed me. The first thing he did on coming into the house was to pour himself a whiskey and soda. My mother, after inspecting the baby, did likewise. I was left to unpack and settle in my room. I was fortunate in having my own room. I was as desirous of my own privacy as much as my mother and stepfather were desirous of theirs. My stepfather, a local businessman, was ready to put up with me, provided I did not get in the way. And in a different way, I was ready to put up with him, provided he leave me alone. I was even willing that my mother should leave me alone. There was a big window to my room, and I opened it to the evening breeze and gazed out on the garden, rather unkempt place, where marigolds and a sort of wild blue everlasting grew rampant among the lychee trees.